Circumstances changed dramatically for the Red Army in the summer of 1936, and it was now put firmly in the focus of attention. During the summer and autumn, there were numerous arrests of senior officers who had been Trotskyists in the past. These arrests coincided with Stalin's wider crackdown on the former political opposition in 1936. Indeed, political tensions within the Soviet Union had increased dramatically from the assassination of the Leningrad Party boss Sergei Kirov in December 1934. At this time, the former political opposition had come under pressure, having been made a scapegoat for the assassination, and the army were not insulated from these political currents, and likewise saw an increase in political arrests from December 1934. But in the summer of 1936, the arrests of these former Trotskyist officers were linked to the investigation into the alleged counter-revolutionary bloc of Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, two former political oppositionists who were put on trial in August and charged with the Kirov assassination and planning to murder Stalin. As there were links to the army, there were now calls from inside the army itself and from the new head of the political police, Nikolai Yezhov, to investigate further into the military to expose the remaining Trotskyist conspirators. An investigation quickly began. As such, the Red Army had been caught up in the growing conspiracy theory that the former political opposition were active and dangerous counter-revolutionaries, and this directly affected former Trotskyists in the army. However, Trotskyists had only ever been a minority in the 1920s, and their arrest in the latter half of 1936 was not enough to spark a crisis. Indeed, the number of arrests were quite small. And the upper military elite, the likes of Tukhachevsky, had never been Trotskyists. And so for the circle of arrests to move beyond Trotskyists, the conspiracy narrative would have to move on from searching for Trotskyist counter-revolution to something which would be able to affect a much wider circle of commanders. And this happened in 1937 with a new emerging threat from foreign spies. This threat from foreign spies had been building since the end of 1936. For example, at a meeting of senior officers in October, it was acknowledged that fascist states were sending agents to work inside the Red Army. Then in early 1937, a new round of rumours began, reporting further links between the Red Army command and the Nazis. And the second Moscow show trial in January 1937 firmly thrust the danger of foreign agents into view. The defendants at this trial were charged not only with acts of domestic terrorism, but of working on the orders of fascist powers. The wider conspiracy narrative of the terror was evolving to take on a much greater international dimension, and this endangered the entire Red Army. During 1937, there were two key moments which sealed the Red Army's fate and brought forward the military purge. The first was the 1937 February-March plenum of the Central Committee, in which Stalin's deputy, Molotov, confirmed that the army needed to be scrutinised. During 1937, the arrests of former Trotskyists had continued, and the army was now coming under increased pressure. Molotov argued that enemies had been discovered in other institutions, and there would be more as yet unexposed in the Red Army. Importantly, Molotov would not have made these comments without Stalin's backing, and so Stalin certainly wanted the army checking. However, what is interesting is that Stalin hesitated again even at this point. Molotov did argue that the army would now be carefully scrutinised, but this was not to happen immediately. There was little urgency. It was likely that the army was seen as too important to shake up without good reason. Stalin knew that he depended on the Red Army, and he was cautious in how he approached it. So for now, this army verification was to be delayed. More evidence of counter-revolution and enemies in the ranks needed to be discovered first. And in fact, this evidence soon emerged. In April and May, incriminating evidence was extracted from arrested members of the political police and army officers about an alleged military conspiracy in the upper ranks, including Tukhachevsky and a number of senior army officers. This evidence would form the basis of the fabricated military fascist plot, which became the basis of the later military purge. There is much to suggest that Yezhov, the head of the political police, had been looking to discover this type of military conspiracy from 1936, and in April and May 1937 he got the evidence he wanted. But there was no guarantee that Stalin would accept this evidence. He'd shown hesitancy in the past towards the army, and this new evidence against the army high command was not particularly strong. So why did Stalin decide to crack down on the army? And why did the resulting military purge go far beyond those incriminated officers such as Tukhachevsky, and eventually affect over 30,000 officers? To answer this question, we need to look at the second key moment for the Red Army in 1937, when the growing spy threat to the army peaked in April and May, at exactly the same time as the incriminating evidence about Tukhachevsky and a military conspiracy was being extracted by the political police. And this is what forced Stalin to abandon any hesitation and restraint he'd shown in the past towards the army, and he was now compelled to act. In April and May, the head of the army, Kliment Voroshilov, had begun to address the spy threat to the army. On the 10th of May, he sent Stalin a long report detailing that the army had been compromised by German, Japanese Trotskyist agents. They'd already done significant damage, and they were in all levels of the Red Army. This was extremely serious, and all officers would now have to be checked. And even though it is very difficult to know for sure the precise moment Stalin decided to move against the army, it is likely that the spy scare is the cause and compelled Stalin to act. Stalin could not fight the approaching war with an army infiltrated by foreign spies. Consequently, all the past suspicions and nagging doubts which had built up against the army were now capitalised upon, and this spy threat finally forced the move against Tukhachevsky. Stalin now sanctioned his arrest and of the other incriminated officers on the basis of the already collected incriminating evidence. Tukhachevsky was arrested late in May, a trial was arranged, and all were found guilty and executed. A large purge then swept over the army over the next 2 years and affected thousands in the search for co-conspirators in the ranks. So, I argue in my research that the acknowledgement that the Red Army was widely infiltrated by foreign spies forced Stalin to move against the military elite. What gave this broader spy threat credibility were not only the past crises in the army, for example in 1927 with the alleged Trotskyist coup, in 1930 with the military specialist plot, both times when Stalin had hesitated, but the long history of how the army was seen as a target of perceived threats from its formation in 1918. This created the impression that the army was vulnerable to subversion and continually reinforced suspicions and nagging doubts about its reliability. In the 20s, the threats were perceived from military specialists, from whites and foreign agents, and from an internal Trotskyist threat. In 1930, a large military specialist plot was exposed, and throughout the rest of the 1930s, the threats from hidden Trotskyists and foreign agents only increased. The arrests of former Trotskyist officers during the summer of 1936 focused attention on the Red Army, about the enemy within. But this was not enough to spark a crisis. But the growing spy threat to the army, which came to a head in May 1937, finally compelled Stalin to act. In 1937, the long history of perceived threats to the army finally took a form that Stalin could no longer ignore. And it was this that pushed him to finally initiate the military purge. He could not act with restraint any longer in the face of an army he believed was heavily infiltrated by foreign agents. This explanation of the military purge fits more comfortably with the problem of why Stalin purged the army on the eve of war. And as shown, Stalin did this because he felt he had no other option. By the middle of 1937, he perceived a threat to the army which was on such a large scale that it was impossible to ignore. In light of this, I want to finish on what this explanation of the military purge means for our greater understanding of the terror. And what my research into the military purge shows is that this was driven by perceived threats. These often had some basis in reality, but largely they were always exaggerated and some were completely imaginary. This provides more weight to the idea that the wider Great Terror itself can only be understood as Stalin's reaction to perceived and exaggerated threats. That Stalin came to perceive that he was surrounded by enemies, that he believed that they had infiltrated the party and the wider Soviet population. Consequently, the Great Terror was not entirely driven by Stalin's desires to consolidate his power. Power was still important, and Stalin did not want to lose this, but the argument put forward here in explanation of the military purge indicates that the Great Terror was reactive. It was a panicked reaction to perceived threats. Stalin believed in the basis of the perceived threats to his regime, or believed them to a great enough extent that he could not afford to take the risk in not acting. So in this respect, as much as Stalin's desire to maintain power is still very important to the Great Terror, so is trying to understand his worldview and how he estimated threats to his power. As this examination of the military purge shows, many of these perceived threats were largely imaginary.